Every father knows the sound of his child's laughter, but Robert Langley had almost forgotten what Emily sounded like. After losing his wife to cancer, watching his 9-year-old daughter retreat into silence had been the hardest part of grief. Their therapist suggested getting a dog might help heal their broken home. Robert took Emily to the finest pet store in the city, determined to find something that would bring back her smile. The perfect, well-trained puppies did nothing for her. Later, walking through the nearby park, he bought her a caramel candy and watched her face carefully for any sign of joy. That's when a scruffy, one-eyed stray darted out from behind a tree, snatched the candy right from his hand, and bolted toward an old gazebo. Emily burst into laughter and ran after the dog. For the first time in months, her eyes sparkled with life again. What made this broken stray so special? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Robert Langley had built his fortune on understanding patterns, on reading data streams and market fluctuations with the precision of a surgeon. But grief, he discovered, followed no algorithm. It arrived uninvited, settled into the corners of his life like dust, and refused every attempt at systematic removal. His fingers found the chain around his neck, feeling for the familiar weight of Sarah's wedding ring. Even now, 13 months after her funeral, he couldn't bring himself to remove it. The simple platinum band had become his anchor, a physical reminder that their love had been real, even as everything else felt like it was dissolving. The house reflected their loss in ways that hurt to acknowledge. Sarah's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen counter where she'd left them the morning of her final hospital admission. Her coffee mug, the one with the faded "World's Best Mom" inscription that Emily had given her for Mother's Day 3 years ago, remained in its place in the dishwasher, untouched. Robert had run the dishwasher countless times since then, but he always moved the mug to the counter first, then placed it back in the same spot afterward. Emily had noticed. Of course she had. Children see everything, even when adults desperately hope they don't. The transformation in his daughter had been gradual at first, then devastatingly swift. During Sarah's illness, Emily had been their little beacon of hope, bringing her mother hand-drawn pictures and carefully selected flowers from their garden. She'd read stories aloud in her clear, confident voice, and Sarah had smiled through the pain, calling Emily her sunshine girl. But after the funeral, the sunshine dimmed. Emily's vibrant chatter gave way to single-word responses. Her drawings became dark, abstract scribbles. She stopped bringing friends home from school, stopped asking for playdates, stopped asking for much of anything at all. Bedtime, once a cherished ritual of stories and songs, became a mechanical process of brushing teeth and saying goodnight to a child who had already turned away toward the wall. Robert threw himself into work with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. His company, Meridian Technologies, had been struggling before Sarah's illness, but under his grief-fueled intensity, it had somehow flourished. 16-hour days became the norm. Weekend conferences, quarterly reviews, strategy sessions that stretched until midnight anything to avoid coming home to the echo of their footsteps in rooms that felt too large and too quiet. The irony wasn't lost on him that his financial success had never been greater. The tech world hailed him as a visionary, a leader who'd revolutionized cloud-based data management. Industry publications featured him on their covers. Investors courted him with increasingly generous offers. But none of it mattered when he returned home each evening to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table, mechanically working through homework with Mrs. Chung, their neighbor who'd become an unofficial babysitter through sheer kindness and proximity. Mrs. Chen was a widow herself, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher who'd lived next door for 15 years. She had a way of appearing whenever Robert felt most lost, showing up with casseroles and gentle suggestions delivered in her soft, accented English. She never offered sympathy, something Robert found himself grateful for, but rather practical, wisdom born from her own experience with loss. "Grief is like winter," she told him one evening as Emily picked at her dinner in silence. "You cannot rush the spring, but you must tend the garden anyway. Small things, daily things. The flowers will come when they're ready." Robert's brother Tom had been less subtle in his concern. 2 years younger and blessed with the kind of easy confidence that had made him successful in real estate, Tom had taken it upon himself to stage what he called interventions every few weeks. He'd arrive with takeout food and an agenda, usually involving suggestions about therapy, dating, or relocating to a smaller house that didn't feel like a mausoleum. "You're disappearing, Rob," Tom had said during his most recent visit. "And so is Emily. Mom and Dad are worried sick. We all are." Robert had nodded and made the appropriate responses, but the truth was that he didn't know how to stop disappearing. He tried therapy. Dr. Martinez came highly recommended and specialized in grief counseling, but the sessions felt like archaeological expeditions in the pain he wasn't ready to excavate. Dr. Martinez spoke about processing and healthy coping mechanisms and giving yourself permission to heal. But Robert found himself nodding politely while calculating quarterly revenue projections in his head. Emily had been seeing Dr. Martinez too, though with what appeared to be even less enthusiasm than Robert. She would emerge from sessions with the same distant expression she wore everywhere else, clutching whatever small toy or sticker the doctor had given her, only to abandon it somewhere in the house where Robert would find it days later. There, home had become a museum of interrupted life. Sarah's book lay open on her nightstand, a bookmark still marking page 247 of a novel she'd never finish. Her jewelry box sat untouched on the dresser, its tiny ballerina frozen mid-spin. Emily's school artwork from before the illness still decorated the refrigerator, but nothing new had been added in months. The kitchen, once the heart of their family life, now served mainly as a staging area for Mrs. Chun's meals and Emily's homework sessions. Sarah had loved to cook, filling the space with the warm scents of garlic and herbs, teaching Emily to measure ingredients and crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl. Now the granite countertops gleamed with disuse, the spice rack gathering dust like an abandoned library. Robert had tried to recreate some of their old routines. He'd attempted to make Sarah's famous Saturday morning pancakes, following her handwritten recipe card with scientific precision. But the kitchen had felt wrong without her voice providing commentary, without her gentle corrections when he stirred too vigorously or heated the pan too high. Emily had eaten 3 bites in polite silence before asking to be excused. He'd bought her expensive gifts, thinking that material gestures might somehow bridge the emotional distance between them. A new bicycle with streamers on the handlebars. An art set with more colored pencils than any child could reasonably use. A dollhouse complete with miniature furniture and tiny inhabitants. Emily accepted each gift with quiet gratitude, played with them for precisely the amount of time that seemed expected, then set them aside with the same careful detachment she applied to everything else. The house itself had become part of the problem. They'd bought it when Emily was 3, drawn by the large backyard and the neighborhood's excellent schools. Sarah had painted Emily's room in shades of purple and yellow, hanging star-shaped lights from the ceiling and filling built-in bookshelves with picture books and stuffed animals. Now the room felt like a shrine to childhood interrupted. Every carefully chosen detail a reminder of the mother, who'd never see her daughter grow up in the space they'd created together. Robert often found himself standing in doorways, paralyzed by the weight of decisions that had once seemed simple. Should he redecorate Emily's room? Would that help her move forward or feel like an erasure of her mother's love? Should he pack away Sarah's belongings? Keep them exactly as they were? Find some middle ground that honored the past while making space for an uncertain future? They Questions multiplied in the silence, each one spawning others until he felt buried under the accumulated weight of unmade choices. So he did what he'd always done when facing overwhelming complexity. He retreated into work, where problems had solutions and effort yielded measurable results. But work, for all its familiar comfort, couldn't fill the hours when Emily needed him most. Bedtime stories had become perfunctory readings from books she'd outgrown. Breakfast was cereal consumed in mutual silence. School pickup involved brief conversations about homework and piano lessons, conversations that skimmed the surface of their shared existence like stones across still water. It was Dr. Martinez who finally suggested the pet store visit, framing it as a way to introduce new sources of joy and responsibility into their routine. Robert had been skeptical. They'd never owned a pet, and the idea of adding another variable to their already precarious emotional ecosystem seemed risky. But Emily had shown the first flicker of interest he'd seen in months when he'd mentioned the possibility. So they'd made the trip on a sunny Saturday afternoon that felt like it was mocking their internal weather. The pet store had been a cathedral of cheerful noise and movement, filled with the kind of unbridled life energy that made their quiet house feel even more like a tomb by comparison. Puppies tumbled over each other in gleaming displays, their enthusiasm infectious to everyone except the small girl standing beside him with her hands clasped carefully behind her back. Robert had pointed out the virtues of various breeds: the gentle Labrador Retriever, the intelligent Border Collie, the loyal Golden Retriever puppy with eyes like melted chocolate. But Emily had observed each animal with the detached interest of a museum visitor, nodding politely at his suggestions while remaining fundamentally unmoved. They'd left empty-handed, Robert's heart sinking as he watched Emily settle into the passenger seat with the same resigned expression she wore everywhere else. The park had been an impulse, a desperate attempt to salvage something from the failed afternoon. And then the caramel candy, Emily's favorite since she was small enough to need help unwrapping it. He'd bought it from a vendor with a cart painted in cheerful stripes, hoping that familiar sweetness might somehow unlock the smile he missed more than breathing. What happened next would replay in his memory for months afterward. The moment when everything changed, when possibility re-entered their lives in the form of a half-blind, battle-scarred dog with timing that seemed almost supernatural. The sound of Emily's laughter, when it finally came, hit him like a physical blow, reminding him of everything they'd lost and everything they might still be able to find. The dog had emerged from behind the old gazebo like something from a fairy tale, if fairy tales included animals that looked like they'd survived a war. One eye was milky white, either blind or damaged beyond repair. Patches of fur were missing from his left flank, revealing old scars that spoke of fights he'd won or lost depending on perspective. His coat, once probably golden or brown, had faded to the color of autumn leaves left too long on the ground. But Emily was laughing, and for Robert, that sound was worth more than every dollar in his considerable bank account. "Can we keep him, Daddy?" The words tumbled out of her mouth with an urgency he hadn't heard in 13 months. "Please, look how much he likes the candy. And he came right to me like he was waiting for us." The dog Emily had immediately started calling him Patch, though Robert couldn't tell if it was because of his missing eye or his mottled coat sat at a cautious distance, watching them with the kind of wariness that suggested extensive experience with disappointment. His tail wagged in small, hopeful movements, as if he was afraid too much enthusiasm might jinx whatever good fortune had brought him to this moment. Robert's practical mind immediately cataloged the problems. They had no dog supplies, no veterinary records, no idea if the animal was healthy or dangerous, or even housebroken. Their home wasn't set up for a pet. Robert traveled frequently for work. Emily was 9 years old and barely managing to take care of herself, let alone another living creature. But Emily was smiling, actually smiling, and touching the dog's head with the kind of gentle reverence usually reserved for something precious and fragile. "We should at least take him to a veterinarian," Robert heard himself saying. "Make sure he's healthy. See if he belongs to someone." The compromise felt reasonable, a way to extend this moment of Emily's happiness without committing to anything permanent. They could have him checked, cleaned up, maybe find his real owner if he had one. In the meantime, Emily could have a few days of the joy that had been so notably absent from her life. The veterinary clinic, they found, was a small practice, tucked between a coffee shop and a bookstore, the kind of neighborhood establishment that suggested competence without pretension. Dr. Rebecca Hayes turned out to be a woman in her late 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of direct manner that Robert found immediately reassuring. "Well, hello there, handsome," she said to Patch, who responded by attempting to hide behind Emily's legs. "And who might you be?" "His name is Patch," Emily announced with proprietorial pride. "We found him in the park, and he stole my candy, but I don't mind because he made me laugh." Dr. Hayes glanced at Robert with raised eyebrows that seemed to ask several questions at once. "Found him, did you? Well, let's have a look at what we're dealing with here." The examination was thorough and gentle, Dr. Hayes maintaining a steady stream of conversation that seemed to calm Patch's obvious anxiety. She checked his teeth, listened to his heart, examined the damaged eye, and ran her hands along his body with the practiced confidence of someone who'd been doing this work for years. "He's probably around 3 years old," she said, making notes on a clipboard. "The eye injury is old, looks like it happened when he was young, maybe a year or so ago. It's healed well, though. Won't cause him any pain. The scars on his flank are from some kind of injury, possibly a car accident or a fight with another animal. Also well healed." Robert found himself studying Dr. Hayes as much as listening to her words. There was something appealing about her competence, the way she handled both the nervous dog and his anxious daughter with equal skill. She wore no wedding ring, he noticed, then immediately felt guilty for noticing. "Is he healthy?" Emily asked, her voice tight with worry. "He's actually in remarkably good shape for a stray," Dr. Hayes said. "Underweight, of course, and he needs a good bath and some basic preventive care. But his heart sounds strong, his teeth are decent, and he doesn't show signs of any serious illness." She turned to Robert, her expression becoming more serious. "The question is what you want to do with him. I can scan for a microchip, put up flyers around the neighborhood, check with local shelters to see if anyone's reported him missing. If he belongs to someone, they deserve to know he's safe." The responsible answer was obvious, but Robert found himself hesitating as he watched Emily gently stroke Patch's head. The dog had relaxed during the examination, even allowing Dr. Hayes to clean his good eye with a damp cloth. But his attention remained focused on Emily, as if he'd decided she was the most important person in a room full of potentially threatening strangers. "How long would that take?" Robert asked. "The search for his owner, a week or two, usually. Most lost pets are reunited with their families within the first few days if they're going to be reunited at all." Dr. Hayes pulled a business card from her pocket, slightly crumpled from being carried around. "In the meantime, he'll need somewhere to stay. I can recommend a good boarding facility, or he can stay with us," Emily interrupted, looking at Robert with an expression of desperate hope. "Can he, Daddy? Just until we find his real family?" Robert looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw something in her eyes that had been missing for months. Not just happiness, but purpose. The kind of focused attention she used to bring to caring for her mother's flowers or helping with dinner preparations. Patch needed her, and Emily, Robert realized, needed to be needed. "Dr. Hayes," he said carefully. "What would he need?" "Supplies, food, toys, that sort of thing." The veterinarian's smile suggested she'd been through this conversation many times before. The basics are simple enough. Food and water bowls, a leash and collar, a bed or blanket he can call his own. Dog food, I'd recommend starting with something gentle on his stomach, since we don't know what he's been eating. Some toys, though he might be too anxious to play much at first. She paused, studying Robert's face with the same attention she'd given Patch's injuries. Are you sure about this? Taking in a stray is a big commitment, even temporarily. Dogs form attachments quickly, especially ones who've been on their own. The longer he stays with you, the harder it'll be if his real owner turns up. His real owner should have taken better care of him, Emily said with 9-year-old certainty. Look at his scars. Look at how skinny he is. If they really loved him, they wouldn't have let him get lost. The logic was unassailable, even if the situation was more complicated than Emily understood. Robert found himself nodding, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to. All right, he said. Let's get him cleaned up and see what we need to take care of him properly. Just temporarily, he added, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Dr. Hayes, Emily, or himself. Dr. Hayes gave Patch a bath in the clinic's treatment room, a process that revealed fur that was actually a warm golden brown beneath the accumulated dirt and neglect. Clean, he looked less like a street fighter and more like someone's beloved companion who'd simply had a run of bad luck. They left the clinic with a bag full of supplies, a schedule for follow-up appointments, and a dog who walked beside Emily, as if he'd been doing it his entire life. Patch seemed to understand that his circumstances had changed, though he remained alert and cautious in the way of creatures who'd learned not to trust good fortune too completely. The car ride home was filled with Emily's chatter, the first sustained conversation she'd initiated in months. She told Patch about their house, about her room, about the backyard where he could run and play. She promised him that he'd be safe, that no one would hurt him, that she would take good care of him for as long as he needed. Robert caught Dr. Hayes' business card in his rearview mirror, where it had fallen on the dashboard. Her direct number was written on the back in neat handwriting, and he found himself looking forward to the follow-up appointment she'd scheduled for the next week. As they pulled into their driveway, Robert realized he'd made a decision that felt both completely irrational and absolutely right. They were keeping the dog, at least for now. Emily was happy, truly happy, for the first time since Sarah's death. Whatever complications lay ahead, they were worth this moment of his daughter's laughter echoing through the car as Patch pressed his nose against the window and wagged his tail at the sight of their house. Robert discovered that bringing home a traumatized stray dog was remarkably similar to conducting a hostile corporate takeover. Both involved careful planning, patience, and the understanding that initial chaos was part of the process. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly Patch would make himself at home, or how dramatically one small animal could disrupt 13 months of carefully maintained order. The first night, Patch refused to sleep anywhere except beside Emily's bed. Robert had prepared a comfortable space in the laundry room, complete with soft blankets and easy access to food and water. But when he went to check on their new house guest before turning in, he found the dog curled up on the rug next to Emily's bed, his good eye fixed on her sleeping form with protective vigilance. He's guarding her, Mrs. Chun observed the next morning when she arrived to find Robert attempting to clean dog hair from his previously pristine hardwood floors. Dogs know when children need protecting, even from sadness they cannot see. Mrs. Chun had a way of appearing at exactly the right moments, usually armed with practical wisdom and often carrying food that somehow perfectly matched whatever crisis was unfolding. This morning she brought homemade soup and an old blanket that had belonged to her late husband's dog. "Give him this," she said, spreading the worn fabric near Emily's bedroom door. "Smells like dog, like home. Will help him settle." The second night established a pattern that would define their new normal. Patch would dutifully eat dinner from his bowl in the kitchen, then follow Emily upstairs for bath time and bedtime stories. As Robert read aloud something he'd started doing again because Emily insisted, Patch needed to hear the stories too. The dog would lie with Liz's chin resting on the edge of Emily's bed, occasionally thumping his tail when voices in. The book grew excited or dramatic. It was during one of these reading sessions that Robert discovered the extent of Patch's trauma. A car backfired in the street outside, and the dog immediately scrambled under Emily's bed, trembling and whimpering in a way that made Emily's eyes fill with tears. "It's okay, Patch," she whispered, lying flat on her stomach so she could reach under the bed to stroke his head. "You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you." The incident reminded Robert that healing wasn't linear, that progress came with setbacks and unexpected moments of vulnerability. When he'd finally coaxed Patch out from under the bed an hour later, the dog's grateful expression seemed to acknowledge something unspoken between them, that they were all working through their own forms of trauma. That patience was required from everyone. By the end of the first week, Patch had claimed several items that technically belonged to other family members. Robert's favorite running shoes now served as a security blanket of sorts, though thankfully not as a chew toy. One of Emily's stuffed animals had been adopted as a sleeping companion. A throw pillow from the living room couch had been relocated to the sunny spot by the kitchen window where Patch liked to doze while Emily did homework. The shoe incident had been Robert's first real test of patience. He discovered his expensive Italian leather loafers, a gift from Sarah for his 40th birthday, thoroughly demolished in the backyard. Not chewed, exactly, but systematically deconstructed with the precision of a creature who understood the difference between destruction and redistribution of materials. His initial reaction had been sharp frustration, the kind of anger that builds when grief and stress find a convenient target. But Emily's stricken expression and Patch's immediate cowering response reminded him that reactions had consequences, that healing environments required gentleness even in moments of justifiable irritation. "It didn't mean to be bad, Daddy," Emily had said, unconsciously echoing words Sarah used to say when Emily herself had made innocent mistakes. "He's just scared and doesn't know the rules yet." So Robert had taken a deep breath, reminded himself that shoes could be replaced but trust could not, and used the moment as a teaching opportunity about appropriate chew toys and house rules. Patch seemed to understand that correction without anger was possible, responding with the kind of grateful attention that suggested previous experiences with disappointment had been less forgiving. The training process became a family project. Emily took charge of teaching basic commands, approaching the task with the seriousness of a general planning a campaign. She checked out library books about dog training, created charts to track Patch's progress, and established a reward system that involved both treats and enthusiastic praise. "Sit," she would say, holding a small biscuit above Patch's nose and waiting patiently for him to comply. When he succeeded, her celebration was so genuine and joyful that Robert found himself smiling despite the accumulated stress of his workday. Mrs. Chun proved invaluable during this adjustment period, sharing insights from her own experience with rescued animals. "Patience is like water," she told Emily one afternoon as they worked together on teaching Patch to walk properly on a leash. "It finds its way around obstacles, makes hard things soft over time." The walking lessons took place in their backyard, initially, since Patch remained nervous around strangers and loud noises. But even this limited space provided revelations about their new family member. Patch was intelligent, responding quickly to consistent cues and demonstrating problem-solving skills that surprised Robert. He was also deeply intuitive about Emily's moods, seeming to sense when she needed comfort and positioning himself accordingly. There were moments of comedy too. Patch's first encounter with the automatic sprinkler system resulted in a soaking wet dog racing through the house trailing water in panic. Convinced he was under attack by forces beyond his understanding, Robert spent 20 minutes with towels and a hairdryer, while Emily dissolved into giggles that reminded him powerfully of her mother's laugh. The food situation required trial and error as well. Dr. Hayes had recommended a gentle diet to help Patch gain weight gradually, but his eating habits reflected the anxiety of a creature who'd never been certain when the next meal might appear. He would gobble his food with desperate efficiency, then immediately seek reassurance that more would be available later. Emily solved this problem with characteristic directness. She began sitting beside Patch during meals, talking to him softly, and occasionally dropping small treats into his bowl to reinforce the idea that good things would continue to happen. Within a few days, his eating had slowed to a more normal pace, though he continued to check the food bowl periodically throughout the day as if confirming its continued existence. The most significant change was in Emily herself, the listless child who'd moved through their house like a ghost for over a year had been replaced by someone with purpose and energy. She woke up eager to check on Patch, spent her after-school time training him and playing fetch in the backyard, and went to bed tired from activity rather than sadness. Robert found himself looking forward to coming home for the first time since Sarah's death, curious about what new development or small triumph would greet him. His 17-hour workdays had gradually shortened to something closer to normal business hours, partly because Emily needed supervision with Patch, but mostly because he'd rediscovered that home could be a place where good things happened. House itself felt different too. Dog toys scattered across expensive rugs somehow made the rooms feel lived in rather than preserved. Patch's presence seemed to give them all permission to be less careful, to accept that life was messy and healing, meant embracing that messiness rather than trying to control it. 3 weeks after Patch's arrival, Emily created her first piece of artwork since her mother's death. Robert discovered it taped to the refrigerator when he came down for his morning coffee, a crayon drawing that stopped him in his tracks with its simple honesty. The picture showed 3 figures standing in front of a house: a tall man, a smaller girl, and a golden dog with 1 brown eye and 1 white eye. Above them, rendered in purple crayon, floated a woman with flowing hair and a smile. She wasn't standing with the family, but she wasn't separate from them either. She was simply there, watching over them with benevolent presence. "Do you like it?" Emily asked from behind him, her voice carefully neutral in the way of children who've offered something precious and fear rejection. "I love it," Robert said, and meant it completely. "Can you tell me about it?" Emily moved to stand beside him, studying her own creation with artistic seriousness. "That's us now," she explained, pointing to the 3 ground-level figures. "And that's Mommy watching to make sure we're okay. I think she likes Patch. He makes us smile again." The drawing remained on the refrigerator, becoming a daily reminder that healing could coexist with remembrance, that moving forward didn't require leaving the past behind. Sarah's presence in Emily's artwork felt natural rather than haunting, as if their daughter had found a way to include her mother in their new reality without being trapped by lost. School had also begun to improve. Mrs. Patterson, Emily's teacher, called to report that Emily was participating in class discussions again and had started eating lunch with friends instead of sitting alone. She'd volunteered to help with the class pet, a rabbit named Snowball, and had written a composition about my dog Patch that was apparently being shared with other teachers as an example of descriptive writing. "She's coming back to us, Mrs. Patterson said during their brief phone conversation. "Whatever you're doing at home, it's working." Robert suspected that Patch deserved most of the credit. The dog had brought routine and responsibility into Emily's life, but more importantly, he'd given her something to love without reservation. Caring for Patch seemed to satisfy some deep need in Emily that Robert hadn't known how to address. a need to nurture and protect that connected her to her mother's memory in positive ways. The local dog park had become their weekend destination, though initially these visits challenged Patch's comfort zone. The fenced area filled with running, barking dogs triggered his anxiety, and he would press against Emily's legs while surveying the chaos with his good eye. But Emily's patience proved transformative. She would sit on a bench with Patch beside her, talking quietly and offering treats while other dogs played around them. Gradually, Patch had begun to relax. First, he'd watch other dogs with interest, rather than fear. Then he'd accept friendly approaches from particularly gentle animals. Finally, he'd begun to engage in tentative play, though always with Emily close by as his safe harbor done. It was during one of these park visits that Robert first spoke at length with Dr. Rebecca Hayes outside the clinical setting. She was there with her own dog, a dignified black Labrador named Sam, who immediately positioned himself as Patch's unofficial mentor and protector. "He's doing remarkably well," Dr. Hayes observed, watching Patch attempt to play tug-of-war with a rope toy while Emily cheered him on. "Dogs with his history don't usually adjust this quickly to family life." "Emily's been amazing with him," Robert said. "She has this way of understanding what he needs before he knows it himself." Dr. Hayes nodded, her attention shifting between Patch and Emily with professional interest. Children and traumatized animals often connect in special ways. They're both learning to trust again, learning that the world can be safe. It's healing for both of them. Robert found himself studying Dr. Hayes as she spoke, noting the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled and the gentle confidence she brought to every interaction. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her veterinary coat, and he realized he found her just as appealing in casual clothes as he had in professional settings. "How long have you been practicing veterinary medicine?" he asked, genuinely curious, but also wanting to extend their conversation. 8 years here in the city, but I grew up on a farm in Vermont. Animals have always been part of my life." She paused, watching Sam demonstrate proper fetch technique for Patch's benefit. "What about you? Emily mentioned you work with computers?" "Technology, consulting mostly. Data management systems for large corporations." Robert realized how dull that sounded compared to healing animals, but Dr. Hayes seemed genuinely interested as he explained the basics of his work. Their conversation was interrupted by Emily's excited call. "Daddy, look! Patch is playing with 3 different dogs, and he's not scared at all." Indeed, Patch had joined a small group of dogs in what appeared to be a canine social gathering around a tennis ball. His tail was wagging, his body language was relaxed, and he seemed to be enjoying himself in a way that would have been unimaginable during his first week with them. "That's wonderful progress," Dr. Hayes said. "He's learning to trust his environment, to believe that good experiences can happen consistently." Robert watched his daughter and their dog, both of them transformed from the broken creatures he'd brought to Dr. Hayes' clinic 3 weeks ago. Emily was laughing as Patch attempted to carry a tennis ball that was slightly too large for his mouth, her face bright with the kind of uncomplicated joy that had once been her default expression. "I should probably ask," Robert said, turning back to Dr. Hayes with an expression that felt more serious than their conversation warranted. "Have you found any signs of an owner looking for him? Posted flyers? Checked with shelters?" Dr. Hayes shook her head. "I've checked all the usual places. No one's reported a dog matching his description. At this point, if someone was looking for him, they would have found him." Stray dogs don't usually maintain the kind of condition he was in without some contact with humans, even if irregular. The news brought relief mixed with a trace of guilt. Robert wanted Patch to be officially theirs, wanted to stop living with the possibility that someone might claim him, just as Emily had fully opened her heart. But he also recognized that his attachment to the dog was partly selfish. Patch had given them back something essential that Robert had begun to fear they'd lost forever. As they prepared to leave the park, Emily carefully clipped Patch's leash and began the patient process of saying goodbye to his new friends. The dog looked back once at the play area, but followed willingly, his trust in Emily complete. "Same time next week?" Dr. Hayes asked, and Robert realized she was addressing him, rather than making a general comment about park schedules. "We'll be here," he said, and found himself looking forward to it in ways that had nothing to do with Patch's socialization needs. Robert found the gardening gloves by accident while searching the garage for a longer extension cord. They were tucked behind a stack of storage boxes, still stained with soil from Sarah's last spring planting season. The leather was soft from use, molded to the shape of hands he could still remember holding. And for a moment the grief hit him with surprising intensity. Sarah had loved gardening with a passion that had initially puzzled Robert. She could spend entire weekends designing flower beds and researching the best varieties for their climate zone. The backyard had been her canvas, transformed from suburban lawn into something that belonged in a magazine. Roses climbed the fence in careful profusion. Herbs grew in neat rows near the kitchen door, and a small vegetable garden produced tomatoes and peppers that made their way into family dinners. After her death, Robert had hired a landscape service to maintain the basic upkeep, but the creative touches had gradually disappeared. The herb garden had been reduced to mowing patterns. The vegetable patch had been replanted with low-maintenance shrubs. The roses still bloomed, but without Sarah's careful pruning and attention, they'd begun to lose their structured beauty. "What are those?" Emily asked, appearing in the garage doorway with Patch at her side. She developed an uncanny ability to find Robert whenever his thoughts turned melancholy, as if some internal radar alerted her to moments when sadness threatened to overwhelm him. "They were your mother's gardening gloves," Robert said, turning the worn leather over in his hands. "She used to wear them when she worked in the backyard." Emily approached with the careful curiosity of a child who'd learned to navigate emotional landmines. "Can I see them?" Robert handed over the gloves, watching as Emily slipped them onto her small hands. They were comically oversized, but she flexed her fingers experimentally, as if testing their magic potential. "Mommy used to let me help her plant flowers," Emily said quietly. "She showed me how to make holes the right size and how to water them without drowning the roots." The memory seemed to spark something in Emily's imagination. She looked from the gloves to the backyard, where Patch was investigating the overgrown remains of Sarah's herb garden with intense interest. "Daddy, could I make a garden for Patch? Somewhere just for him, with plants he could smell and places to dig that wouldn't make you angry?" The idea surprised Robert with its thoughtfulness. Emily had been watching Patch explore their yard for weeks, noting his preferences and behaviors. With the attention of a naturalist, she'd observed that he liked to rest in sunny spots, that certain scents captured his interest, that he had an instinctive desire to dig that their current landscaping didn't accommodate. "What kind of garden did you have in mind?" Robert asked. Emily's face lit up with the focused enthusiasm she brought to projects that truly captured her imagination. "Well, there's that corner by the fence where nothing grows very well anyway. We could put in plants that smell good, not just to us, but to dogs. And maybe a sandbox area where he could dig without hurting anything important. And a place for him to lie in the shade when it's hot." The project took shape over the following weekend, with Emily serving as project manager and Robert providing manual labor under her detailed supervision. They removed the struggling grass from a corner section of the yard, Emily working beside him with Sarah's gloves folded back at the wrists to accommodate her smaller hands. Patch supervised their efforts with the intense interest of someone whose future comfort was at stake. He investigated each change to his environment, offered suggestions in the form of strategic digging, and provided quality control by testing the comfort level of various potential resting spots. Dr. Hayes proved unexpectedly helpful when Emily called the veterinary clinic to ask about dog-safe plants. She arrived the following Saturday with a small collection of herbs and flowers that would appeal to canine senses without posing health risks. "Lavender is wonderful for calming nervous dogs," she explained as Emily carefully transplanted small, purple plants around the designated area. "And rosemary has a scent that most dogs find interesting, but not overwhelming." Robert watched Dr. Hayes work alongside Emily, noting how naturally she moved between practical instruction and gentle encouragement. She'd brought her own gardening gloves and seemed completely comfortable kneeling in the dirt, her auburn hair escaping its ponytail as she helped Emily create proper spacing for their plantings. "This is really thoughtful," Dr. Hayes said to Robert as Emily and Patch explored the newly installed sandbox area. "Most people don't consider their pet's sensory environment this carefully. It was entirely Emily's idea," Robert said. "She's been watching Patch, figuring out what would make him happy. I'm just a manual labor. Still, you're supporting her instincts instead of dismissing them. That's not as common as it should be." The compliment warmed Robert more than seemed proportional to the comment. He found himself looking for excuses to extend Dr. Hayes' visit, offering coffee and asking questions about plant care that he could easily have researched online. Emily's garden became a family project that extended well beyond the initial weekend. She created a watering schedule and took charge of daily maintenance, approaching the responsibility with the seriousness she'd once brought to caring for her mother during illness. Patch quickly claimed the space as his own, spending morning hours surveying his domain from various vantage points and afternoon naps in the carefully planned shade area. The transformation in Emily was as dramatic as the change in their backyard. She began talking about future additions to Patch's garden, researching dog psychology and plant biology with the enthusiasm of a graduate student. Her school projects started featuring themes related to animal welfare and environmental stewardship. More importantly, working in the garden seemed to connect Emily to positive memories of her mother without the overwhelming sadness that had previously accompanied any mention of Sarah. She would tell Patch stories about his grandmother Sarah, explaining how she taught Emily to identify different plants and understand the seasonal cycles of growth and rest. "Mommy would have loved this garden," Emily said one evening as they watered the new plantings together. She always said that growing things was like giving the world little presents that kept giving back. Robert realized that Emily had found a way to honor her mother's memory while creating something entirely new, something that belonged to their current life rather than their past. The garden represented growth in the most literal sense, but also Emily's ability to channel her grief into nurturing rather than withdrawal. Mrs. Chun had observed the project's progress with her characteristic blend of practical advice and philosophical insight. "Gardens teach patience," she told Emily. "They show us that beautiful things take time, that caring for something every day makes it stronger." As Robert watched Emily teach Patch to navigate the garden pathways without disturbing the carefully planted borders, he realized they were all learning similar lessons about patience and care, about the daily work required to nurture growth. After loss, the photograph happened by accident, which somehow made it perfect. Robert had been trying to capture a picture of Emily's completed garden project when Patch wandered into the frame, positioning himself between Emily and the camera. With the timing of a professional model, Emily burst into laughter at the dog's serious expression. Robert pressed the shutter instinctively, and suddenly they had their first family photo in over a year. Looking at the image on his phone screen, Robert felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The three of them looked like a family. Not the same family they'd been before, but a real family nonetheless, complete and functional and genuinely happy. "Can we print that one?" Emily asked, studying the photo with the same intense focus she brought to her garden planning. "I want to put it on my knitstand." Robert had the photo printed in several sizes, finding reasons to display it in multiple locations throughout the house. The largest version went on the mantel in the living room, replacing a formal portrait from Emily's 6th birthday that had always felt too posed and serious. This new photo captured something authentic: Emily's natural smile, Patch's alert contentment, and Robert's own expression of surprised joy. The dog park had become their regular Saturday morning routine, with Patch now greeting his canine friends with enthusiasm rather than anxiety. Dr. Hayes and Sam were usually there as well, and Robert found himself looking forward to these encounters with an anticipation that felt suspiciously like dating excitement. "He's become quite the social butterfly," Dr. Hayes observed as Patch engaged in an elaborate game of chase with 3 other dogs. "6 weeks ago, I wasn't sure he'd ever trust humans again, let alone other animals. Emily deserves all the credit," Robert said, though he was beginning to suspect that his own emotional availability had also played a role in Patch's recovery. "She has this intuitive understanding of what he needs. Children often do. They haven't learned to overthink emotional connections the way adults have." Dr. Hayes paused, watching Emily demonstrate proper fetch technique to a younger child whose puppy hadn't mastered the concept of bringing the ball back. "How are you doing, though? It can't be easy, managing work and single parenthood and a recovering dog all at once." The question surprised Robert with its directness and its genuine concern. Most people asked about Emily or praised his parenting efforts, but few inquired about his own emotional state with such straightforward interest. "Better than I expected," he said honestly. "Patch has given us both something to focus on besides grief. Having a purpose beyond just getting through. Each day has been," he paused, searching for the right word. "Healing, I suppose." Dr. Hayes nodded with the understanding of someone who'd seen grief's many faces in her work with families and their beloved animals. "Loss changes the landscape of our lives. Sometimes we need new landmarks to help us navigate the terrain." Robert found himself studying her profile as she spoke, noting the way afternoon sunlight brought out auburn highlights in her hair and the laugh lines around her eyes that suggested someone who found genuine joy in her daily work. She wore a simple sundress and sandals, looking more like someone's favorite teacher than a veterinary professional, and he realized he was attracted to her warmth as much as her competence. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" The question emerged before Robert's cautious nature could intervene. "I mean, away from the dog park. Just to talk." Dr. Hayes turned to face him fully, her expression shifting through surprise to consideration, to something that might have been pleased anticipation. "I'd like that," she said, "though I should probably warn you that I tend to talk about animals quite a lot, even when I'm not working." "I think I can handle that," Robert said, feeling something that had been closed off for over a year beginning to open again. Their first coffee date took place the following Wednesday evening, after Emily was settled with homework and Mrs. Chun had agreed to supervise the evening routine. Robert chose a quiet cafe near Dr. Hayes' clinic, somewhere they could talk without the background chaos of children and dogs that usually accompanied their interactions. Dr. Hayes' Rebecca, as she insisted he call her outside professional settings, proved to be as engaging in conversation as she was skilled in her work. She talked about growing up on her family's Vermont farm, about the decision to pursue veterinary medicine, about the challenges and rewards of working with both animals and their human families. "Every case teaches me something," she said, warming her hands around a coffee mug decorated with climbing roses. "Animals are honest in ways that humans often struggle with. They can't hide their pain or pretend to be okay when they're not. Working with them has taught me to pay attention to what people don't say as much as what they do." Robert found himself sharing details about his life that he rarely discussed with anyone, his struggle to balance ambition with family priorities, his grief over losing Sarah, his concerns about whether he was providing Emily with everything she needed for healthy development. Grief doesn't follow timelines, Rebecca said when he mentioned his worry that he should be further along in his emotional recovery. And there's no right way to rebuild a life after loss. What matters is that you're showing up for Emily, that you're willing to let your family evolve rather than trying to preserve what was. The conversation flowed with an ease that surprised Robert. Rebecca was intellectually curious, emotionally intelligent, and completely unpretentious about her expertise. She asked thoughtful questions about his work, seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts about technology and business strategy, and shared her own professional challenges without making them sound insurmountable. When Robert mentioned his concern about whether dating was fair to Emily so soon after her mother's death, Rebecca's response was characteristically direct and reassuring. Children are remarkably adaptable when they feel secure in their primary relationships, she said. Emily knows you love her, knows she's your priority. Watching you build healthy adult connections actually models important life skills for her. They talked for 2 hours, conversation ranging from serious topics to shared observations about their small community to stories that made them both laugh. When Robert finally walked Rebecca to her car, he felt lighter than he had in months, energized by the possibility of adult companionship that wasn't centered on crisis management or professional obligations. "I'd like to do this again," he said as Rebecca unlocked her car door. "So would I," she replied, and the smile she gave him felt like a promise of good things to come. Driving home, Robert realized that he was beginning to believe in the possibility of happiness again. Not the uncomplicated joy he'd shared with Sarah that belonged to a different phase of his life, but something new and different, and potentially just as meaningful. Emily was waiting when he arrived home, eager for details about his evening out and full of reports about Patch's behavior during his absence. The dog had apparently spent the evening moving between Emily's bedroom and the front window, dividing his attention between protecting his primary charge and watching for Robert's return. "Did you have a good time?" Emily asked with the careful casualness of a child who's learned to read adult moods for signs of stability or disruption. "I did," Robert said honestly. "Dr. Hayes is very nice to talk with when there aren't dogs demanding our attention." Emily nodded approvingly, as if she'd already determined that Dr. Hayes met her standards for potential additions to their family circle. "Patch likes her too," she said. "And Sam, I think they could visit us here sometime if you wanted." The suggestion was so perfectly Emily practical, generous, and focused on everyone's comfort that Robert found himself smiling as he tucked her into bed. Their family was growing and changing in ways he couldn't have imagined 6 months ago. But the foundation remained strong. Love, he was learning, didn't diminish when shared, but rather multiplied in unexpected and wonderful ways. The poster had been there for weeks, weathered and faded to the point where Robert had stopped noticing it during their regular park visits. It was Emily who finally saw it clearly, or perhaps she'd simply reached the right height and angle to read the text that had been obscured by her smaller stature during previous visits. "Daddy," she said, her voice carrying a strange quality that made Robert look up from his conversation with Rebecca about weekend plans. "Daddy, you need to see this." Emily was standing in front of the community bulletin board near the park's main entrance, her face pale and her hand trembling slightly, as she pointed to a piece of paper that had been stapled among dozens of other announcements. Robert approached with growing unease, some instinctive part of his mind already preparing for bad news. The flyer was simple and heartbreaking in its desperate clarity. Lost DOG. Reward lucky. Male. 3 years old. Golden brown coat missing. One eye. Distinctive scars on left side. Lost during medical emergency. Please help, my best friend is missing. If found, please call Harold at 5584-72931. Any information appreciated. He's all I have left. Below the text was a photograph that removed any possibility of doubt. Patch. Their Patch stared back at them from the faded paper, younger, and healthier looking than when they'd found him, but unmistakably the same dog. The picture showed him sitting beside an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, both of them looking directly at the camera with the comfortable familiarity of long companionship. "That's him," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of other families enjoying their Saturday morning. "That's our Patch, but his name is really Lucky." Robert felt the world shift underneath him, as if the ground had suddenly become unreliable. For 2 months, they'd built their new life around the assumption that Patch belonged to them, that his arrival had been a gift from whatever forces governed fate and healing. The possibility that someone else was looking for him, someone who might have a stronger claim to his loyalty and affection, had become theoretical, unlikely enough to ignore. But here was evidence that Patch had been loved before. That somewhere in the city was a man named Harold, who'd been searching for his lost companion with the kind of persistent hope that spoke of genuine devotion. "What does this mean?" Emily asked, though her tone suggested she already understood the implications all too well. "It means we need to call this number," Robert said quietly. "We need to find out what happened and make sure Patch Lucky gets back to where he belongs." Emily's face crumpled with the kind of devastation that only children can express, immediate and complete and utterly without artifice. "But he belongs with us now. He's happy with us. We love him." Rebecca had approached. During this exchange, reading the situation from their body language before she'd even seen the poster. When Robert showed her the flyer, her expression shifted through recognition to professional concern to something that looked like personal sadness. "How long has this been posted?" she asked, examining the paper's condition. "Hard to say. Weeks? Maybe longer." Robert felt numb, his mind already calculating the legal and ethical implications, while his heart recoiled from the possibility of losing the creature who'd brought his family back to life. "We have to call him," Emily said suddenly, her voice steadying with the kind of resolve that reminded Robert powerfully of her mother. "We have to make sure Harold is okay, and find out what happened to make Lucky get lost." The maturity of Emily's response surprised and impressed Robert. Even in her obvious distress, she was thinking about Harold's feelings, about the unknown story behind Lucky's disappearance. Her first instinct was toward kindness rather than self-protection. They called the number from Rebecca's phone, since Emily insisted she should be the one to speak with Harold first. The conversation was brief and heartbreaking in its politeness. "Hello," Emily said when the call connected. "Is this Harold? I'm calling about your lost dog, Lucky." Robert could hear the elderly man's voice through the phone, shaky with emotion. "And hope. You found him? Is he okay? Where has he been?" "He's safe," Emily said, tears streaming down her face even as she maintained her composure. "He's been staying with my family. We call him Patch, but we didn't know his real name was Lucky. We didn't know someone was looking for him." The conversation that followed revealed the outline of a story that paralleled their own in its mixture of love and loss. Harold Winters was 78 years old and recently widowed. Lucky had belonged originally to Harold's wife Margaret, a gift Harold had given her during her final illness. When Margaret died 6 months ago, Lucky had become Harold's primary companion and source of comfort. The dog had disappeared during Harold's own medical emergency, a heart attack that had required ambulance transport and several days in the hospital. Harold had been released to an empty apartment, with no idea what had happened to Lucky during the chaos of his medical crisis. He'd been searching ever since, posting flyers throughout the city and calling every animal shelter within a 50-mile radius. "I understand if you've grown attached to him," Harold said, his voice heavy with resignation. "He's easy to love, but he's all I have left of Margaret, the last connection to the life we built together." Emily looked at Robert with an expression that broke his heart. "We'd like to meet you," she said into the phone. "If that's okay." Want to make sure Lucky is happy with whatever we decide." They arranged to meet Harold at his apartment the following afternoon, a plan that gave them 24 hours to process the situation and prepare for what seemed likely to be an excruciating goodbye. Rebecca offered to accompany them, partly in her professional capacity, but mostly as emotional support for what promised to be a difficult encounter. That night, Emily curled up with Patch in his favorite spot by her bedroom window, talking to him in the quiet voice she used for serious conversations. Robert found them there an hour after bedtime, Emily stroking the dog's head while tears ran silently down her cheeks. "I want him to be happy," she said when Robert sat down beside them, "even if that means he can't stay with us. But it's going to hurt so much to say goodbye." Robert gathered his daughter and their dog into a careful embrace, feeling the weight of a decision that had no good options. They could keep Lucky and know that Harold was grieving the loss of his final connection to his wife, or they could return him and face the devastating impact on Emily's emotional recovery. "Sometimes loving someone means making choices that hurt us but help them," Robert said, echoing wisdom that Sarah had shared during her own illness. "But we don't have to make any decisions tonight. Tomorrow we'll meet Harold and figure out what's best for everyone, including Lucky." Patch seemed to sense the emotional complexity of the situation, staying closer to Emily than usual and offering the kind of steady comfort that had become his specialty. His presence reminded Robert that their bond with the dog was real and meaningful, regardless of what legal or ethical obligations they might have to his original owner. As Robert watched Emily finally fall asleep with her hand resting on Patch's head, he realized they were facing another test of their healing journey. The easy answers they'd built their recovery around were about to be challenged by the messy realities of love, loss, and competing claims on affection. The morning brought no clarity, only the approaching certainty of an encounter that would reshape their family again, just as they'd begun to believe they'd found their new normal. Whatever happened next, Robert knew they would face it together, that the strength they'd built over the past 2 months would have to sustain them through whatever difficult choices lay ahead. Harold Winters lived in a modest apartment complex on the other side of the city, the kind of place where retired people went when maintaining a house became too difficult. But nursing homes remained too depressing to consider. The building was clean and well-maintained, with small balconies and a community garden that suggested residents who still cared about their surroundings. Robert parked in the visitor section, noting how Emily sat perfectly still in the back seat with Patch pressed against her side. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, his usual car ride enthusiasm replaced by alert watchfulness. Rebecca had driven separately and was waiting by the building's entrance, her professional composure intact but her eyes reflecting the same sadness Robert felt. "Remember," Robert said, turning to look at Emily before they got out of the car, "we're here to listen and understand. Whatever we decide, we'll decide together, okay?" Emily nodded solemnly, clipping Patch's leash with the careful attention she brought to important tasks. The dog stayed close to her side as they approached the building, though his good eye surveyed their surroundings with increasing interest, as if something about this place sparked recognition. Harold's apartment was on the 3rd floor, and Robert could hear their footsteps echoing in the stairwell as they climbed. Emily had insisted on bringing one of Patch's favorite toys, a squeaky hamburger that had been a recent gift from Rebecca. Though she couldn't explain why it seemed important to have it with them, Harold opened the door before they could knock, as if he'd been watching from his window for their arrival. He was smaller than Robert had expected, probably 5'6" and thin in the way of elderly men who'd forgotten to eat regularly since losing their wives. His eyes were the same gentle brown as in the photograph, but they held a wariness that spoke of recent disappointment and too much hope deferred. "You must be Emily," Harold said, his voice carrying the formal politeness of someone who'd grown up in an era when children were addressed with particular courtesy. "And this must be Lucky." The transformation in Patch was immediate and undeniable. His tail began wagging with an intensity Robert had never seen, his entire body vibrating with excitement as he strained toward Harold. When the elderly man knelt down, Patch broke free from Emily's careful grip and launched himself into Harold's arms with the kind of joyful recognition that left no doubt about their history together. "There's my boy," Harold whispered, his voice breaking as Patch covered his face with kisses and whined with happiness. "I've missed you so much. I looked everywhere for you." Emily's face went very pale, but she maintained her composure as she watched the reunion unfold. Robert felt his heart break as he saw his daughter realize what he was beginning to understand, that Patch's joy at seeing Harold was different from his affection for them, deeper and more fundamental, the joy of coming home rather than the gratitude of being rescued. Harold's apartment was small but filled with evidence of a long and loving marriage. Photographs covered every available surface, showing Harold and a smiling woman with silver hair through decades of shared experiences, vacations, holidays, quiet moments at home. In many of the more recent photos, Patch appeared as a younger, healthier dog, clearly beloved and integral to their family life. "Margaret chose him," Harold explained as he led them to a small living room, dominated by a well-worn recliner and a dog bed that had obviously seen regular use. "She saw him at the shelter when he was just a puppy, said he had kind eyes and needed someone to believe in him. He'd been returned twice by other families. Apparently, the eye injury made people nervous about his temperament." Harold pulled out a photo album, his hands shaking slightly as he opened it to reveal page after page of images documenting Lucky's life with them. Margaret teaching him to sit, Lucky as a gangly adolescent learning to fetch, the dog curled up beside Margaret's hospital bed during her final illness. "He never left her side during the treatment," Harold said, his voice thick with memory. "The nurses said they'd never seen such devotion. He seemed to understand that she needed him to be strong, to be her companion when the pain got too bad for conversation." Emily listened to Harold's stories with the intense attention she brought to subjects that mattered deeply to her. She asked questions about Margaret, about Lucky's puppyhood, about their life together before illness changed everything. Robert watched his daughter processing information that was clearly painful, but that she seemed determined to understand completely. What happened the day he got lost? Emily asked quietly. Harold's expression grew pained as he recounted the morning 6 months ago, when chest pains had sent him to the hospital in an ambulance. In the confusion of the medical emergency, neighbors had promised to look after Lucky, but the dog had apparently panicked when Harold didn't return that evening. Sometime during Harold's 3-day hospital stay, Lucky had broken out of the apartment and disappeared into the city. "I came home to an empty apartment," Harold said. "No note from the neighbors, no sign of where he'd gone. I was still weak from the heart attack, but I started searching immediately. Posted flyers, called shelters, drove around neighborhoods, looking for any sign of him." The apartment showed evidence of Harold's months-long search. Maps with marked locations covered a small desk. Phone numbers for animal shelters and rescue organizations were taped to the refrigerator and stacks of flyers with Lucky's photograph sat ready for distribution. "I never stopped believing I'd find him," Harold said. "He was all I had left of our life together, the only thing that made the apartment feel like home instead of just a place to wait for the end." Rebecca had remained mostly quiet during these revelations, but now she spoke up with gentle professionalism. "Harold, can you tell us about Lucky's medical history? We've been calling him Patch, and he's been healthy during his time with Emily's family, but it would help to know about any ongoing concerns." Harold produced a thick folder of veterinary records that documented Lucky's care from puppyhood through Margaret's illness. The dog had been well loved and carefully maintained, with regular checkups, vaccinations, and dental care that spoke of owners who considered pet care a serious responsibility. "The eye injury happened when he was about 18 months old," Harold explained. hit by a car in front of our old house. Margaret insisted we spend whatever it took to save him, said. He'd already been abandoned once and deserved people who wouldn't give up on him when things got difficult. As Harold talked, Lucky had positioned himself between the elderly man and Emily, as if trying to bridge two worlds he didn't want to choose between. The dog's body language reflected confusion and stress. He was clearly happy to see Harold, but he kept looking back at Emily with expressions that seemed to ask for reassurance that she wasn't going anywhere. He's torn, Rebecca observed quietly to Robert. Dogs form powerful attachments to people who care for them during trauma. His bond with Emily is real, even if his original bond with Harold runs deeper. Emily had been unusually quiet during the visit, absorbing Harold's stories and watching Lucky's responses with the careful attention she brought to complex problems. Finally, she spoke up with a question that surprised everyone. "Harold, are you lonely in this apartment by yourself?" The directness of the question, delivered with 9-year-old matter-of-factness, seemed to catch Harold off guard. He looked around his small living space as if seeing it through Emily's eyes. The single-place setting at the kitchen table, the television position for one viewer, the silence that must have filled the room since Margaret's death. "Yes," he admitted, quietly, "very lonely." Lucky was the only thing that made the days feel purposeful. Feeding him, walking him, having someone who was happy to see me come home, it gave me a reason to get up each morning. Emily nodded thoughtfully, then surprised them all again. "Would you like to come to our house for dinner sometime?" So Lucky could see both his families. The suggestion hung in the air like a bridge nobody had thought to build, a possibility that hadn't occurred to any of the adults who'd been thinking in terms of either or rather than both end. Harold's eyes filled with tears, whether from gratitude or surprise or simple longing for connection. Robert couldn't tell. "I would like that very much," Harold said, "if you're sure it wouldn't be an imposition." As they prepared to leave Harold's apartment, Emily made one more gesture that revealed the depth of her emotional intelligence. She pressed Lucky's squeaky hamburger toy into Harold's hands. "This is his favorite," she said. "He likes to carry it around when he's feeling nervous. Maybe it will help him feel better about being apart from us until we figure out what to do." Harold accepted the toy with the reverence of someone receiving a sacred trust, understanding that Emily was offering more than just a plaything. She was sharing custody of Lucky's comfort, acknowledging that his happiness might require contributions from both families. The drive home was quiet, each of them lost in thoughts about what they'd learned and what it might mean for their future. Lucky sat pressed against Emily in the back seat, his good eye moving between her face and the apartment building they were leaving behind, as if he too was trying to solve a puzzle that had no easy answer. "What are you thinking, sweetheart?" Robert asked as they pulled into their driveway. Emily was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on Lucky's head as she organized her thoughts. "I'm thinking that love doesn't have to be about choosing," she said finally. "Maybe it can be about sharing instead." The dinner invitation had been Emily's idea, but Robert found himself putting as much thought into the evening as he had into important business presentations. Harold would be their first real dinner guest since Sarah's death, and somehow the occasion felt like a test of whether their home could still welcome people who weren't just passing through their grief. Emily had insisted on helping with every aspect of the preparation, from menu planning to table setting. She'd chosen Harold's favorite foods based on their conversation at his apartment pot roast with vegetables, mashed potatoes, and apple pie for dessert. The meal required more cooking than Robert had attempted in over a year, but Emily supervised the process with the seriousness of a professional chef. "Harold probably hasn't had a home-cooked meal in a long time," she explained as she carefully arranged flowers from her garden in a small vase for the dining room table. Living alone in that apartment, eating by himself every day, it must be so sad. Lucky seemed to understand that something special was happening. He'd been unusually alert all afternoon, moving between the kitchen where Robert was cooking and the front window where he could watch for visitors. His behavior reminded Robert of the way the dog had acted before thunderstorms, as if he could sense atmospheric changes that humans couldn't detect. Harold arrived exactly on time, carrying a small wrap package and wearing what was clearly his best shirt and tie. He moved carefully, like someone who'd learned to navigate the world with deliberate precision after losing the person who used to help him make decisions about daily life. Lucky's greeting was exuberant but brief. He rushed to Harold with tail wagging enthusiasm, accepted pets, and gentle words, then immediately returned to Emily's side, as if confirming that his primary loyalty remained unchanged. The gesture seemed to surprise Harold, though he hid his disappointment well. "Something smells wonderful," Harold said, handing the wrapped package to Emily. "I hope you don't mind. I brought a little something for you." Inside the package was a small hand-knitted dog sweater in shades of blue and green, clearly made with considerable skill and attention to detail. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with tiny cables and a pattern that incorporated what looked like stylized flowers. "Margaret made this for Lucky when he was smaller," Harold explained, his voice soft with memory. "She was always worried he'd get cold in the winter, with his thin coat and that injured eye making him more sensitive to weather. She spent weeks working on it, adjusting the fit and adding details she thought he'd like." Emily held the sweater reverently, understanding immediately that she was being entrusted with something precious. "It's beautiful," she said. "Can we try it on him?" The process of getting Lucky into the sweater was complicated by his general suspicion of clothing. But Emily's patience and Harold's gentle encouragement eventually won out. The garment fit perfectly, as if Margaret had somehow anticipated Lucky's adult size when she'd created it years ago. She would have loved seeing him wear it again, Harold said, his eyes bright with unshed tears. She always said that love was something you could knit into fabric, that handmade things carried the feelings of the person who made them. During dinner, Harold shared stories about Margaret that painted a picture of a woman who would have loved Emily instantly. Margaret had been a retired elementary school teacher who volunteered at animal shelters and grew vegetables for the local food bank. She taught Harold to cook, helped him learn patience with living creatures, and shown him that caring for something vulnerable could be a source of strength rather than burden. She used to say that Lucky chose us rather than the other way around, Harold said as Emily listened with rapt attention. Said he had this way of knowing exactly when we needed comfort, when one of us was having a difficult day or feeling unwell. Robert watched the easy conversation between Harold and Emily, noting how naturally they connected despite the 69-year age difference between them. Harold treated Emily with the respectful attention of someone who'd spent a career working with children, while Emily responded with the kind of focused interest she usually reserved for topics that fascinated her completely. "Harold," Emily said during dessert, her tone carrying the careful seriousness she brought to important questions, "do you think Lucky is happier with us or with you?" The question was so direct, so purely Emily in its refusal to dance around difficult subjects that both men fell silent. Harold considered his response carefully, looking at Lucky, who was now lying beside Emily's chair in his new sweater, contentedly chewing on a rope toy. "I think," Harold said slowly, "that Lucky is happy when he feels useful, when he has someone to take care of. With Margaret and me, he was our companion and protector. With you, he's become something even more important. He's been your healer, helping you learn to smile again after losing your mother." Harold paused, watching Emily's face carefully. "The question isn't whether he's happier with one family or the other. The question is whether there's a way for him to be part of both families, to have all the people he loves in his life instead of having to choose between them." Emily's eyes lit up with the spark that always appeared when she encountered a problem with an unexpected solution. "Like shared custody?" Like when parents get divorced but still both love their children. Something like that, Harold agreed. Though I suspect Lucky might have some opinions about how such an arrangement should work. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Lucky stood and moved to position himself directly between Harold and Emily, resting his head first on Harold's knee, then on Emily's, as if demonstrating the exact solution he'd been hoping for all along. The shared custody arrangement began as a trial period, with carefully planned transitions that would minimize stress for Lucky, while allowing both families to maintain meaningful relationships with him. Rebecca had suggested starting with short visits that gradually extended as everyone adjusted to the new routine. Animals adapt remarkably well to structured arrangements, she'd explained during a consultation that felt more like family therapy than veterinary advice. The key is consistency and clear communication about expectations. They worked out a schedule that honored both Harold's need for companionship and Emily's attachment to Lucky as her primary source of comfort. Weekdays would be spent with Emily and Robert, allowing Lucky to maintain his role in Emily's daily routine and after-school activities. Weekends would alternate between families, with Harold taking Lucky for extended visits that would give him purpose and help combat the loneliness that had plagued him since Margaret's death. The first transition had been emotionally challenging for everyone involved. Emily had prepared a careful bag of Lucky's belongings, his favorite toys, blankets that smelled like home, and detailed written instructions about his eating schedule and bedtime preferences. Harold had received these items with the solemnity of someone being entrusted with state secrets. He likes to sleep where he can see the bedroom door, Emily had explained, demonstrating the exact placement of Lucky's bed that would maximize his comfort. And if he has bad dreams, just talk to him quietly. He doesn't like to be touched when he's scared, but he likes to know you're there. The wisdom in Emily's observations impressed both Harold and Robert. She developed an intuitive understanding of Lucky's trauma responses and had learned to provide comfort in ways that respected his boundaries while still offering reassurance. Harold's apartment had required modifications to accommodate a dog again. He'd retrieved Lucky's old bed from storage, set up food and water stations in familiar locations, and even arranged his furniture to recreate some of the spatial relationships Lucky would remember from his life with Margaret. It's like he never left, Harold had reported after Lucky's first overnight stay. He went straight to his old sleeping spot, found the toy Margaret had hidden under the couch, even remembered which corner of the bathroom had the best water dish placement. But Harold also acknowledged that Lucky had changed during his months with Emily. The dog was more confident, less anxious about strangers, and had developed play behaviors that hadn't existed during his previous life as companion to an elderly couple dealing with serious illness. Emily taught him how to be a young dog again, Harold observed during one of their Sunday evening transitions. Margaret and I loved him deeply, but our life together was quiet, focused on managing her treatment and my recovery from the heart attack. Emily showed him that life could include joy and adventure, not just comfort and security. The arrangement created an extended family structure that surprised everyone with how naturally it evolved. Harold began joining them for dinner twice a week, sharing stories about Margaret and offering Emily the kind of intergenerational wisdom that grandparents usually provided. Emily, in turn, helped Harold navigate modern technology, teaching him to video chat so he could see Lucky even during their days apart. Mrs. Chun had observed these developments with her characteristic blend of practical acceptance and philosophical insight. Love multiplies when shared, she'd told Robert one evening as they watched Emily teach Harold to use the dog park's new agility equipment. Child learns this faster than adults, understands that caring for others makes caring easier, not harder. The legal aspects of their arrangement had been surprisingly straightforward. Harold had retained official ownership of Lucky, while Robert had been designated as an authorized caretaker with full decision-making authority during the dog's time with Emily. Rebecca had helped them create a detailed care agreement that specified everything from emergency contact procedures to vacation arrangements. More importantly, the emotional aspects of their arrangement had created unexpected benefits for everyone involved. Harold's loneliness had been significantly reduced by his regular involvement in Emily and Robert's life. Emily had gained not just continued access to Lucky, but also a grandfather figure who provided perspective and support that complemented her father's efforts. Robert found himself genuinely enjoying Harold's company, appreciating the older man's gentle wisdom and dry sense of humor. Harold had become a regular fixture at Emily's school events and weekend activities, filling a role that neither Robert nor Emily had realized they'd been missing. "He's like the grandfather I never got to meet," Emily had told Rebecca during one of Lucky's regular checkups. "Daddy's parents died before I was born, and Mommy's parents lived too far away to visit very often. Having Harold around makes our family feel more complete." Rebecca had watched these developments with professional satisfaction and personal warmth. Her relationship with Robert had deepened alongside their growing extended family, and she'd become an integral part of their support network. "You've created something remarkable," she'd told Robert during one of their now regular coffee dates. "Most custody arrangements focus on minimizing conflict and protecting individual interests. You've built something that actually multiplies the love and support available to everyone involved." The success of their arrangement had become a source of community interest and admiration. Other families dealing with similar challenges had begun seeking their advice about creative solutions to pet custody and elder care issues. Harold had summarized their success most eloquently during Emily's birthday celebration, when Lucky had been presented with a special cake made from dog-safe ingredients. Margaret used to say that family wasn't just about blood relationships. Harold had observed as Lucky enthusiastically demolished his birthday treat. She believed that family was about people who showed up for each other, who chose to care, even when it was difficult or inconvenient. "I think she would have loved seeing how this family chose to grow instead of shrink when faced with impossible choices." 6 months later, the wall calendar in Robert's kitchen had become a complex document that would have challenged a corporate project manager. Color-coded entries tracked Lucky's custody schedule, Harold's dinner visits, Emily's school events, Rebecca's veterinary appointments, and the various family activities that had evolved from their unconventional arrangement. Emily had taken charge of calendar management with the same attention to detail she brought to Lucky's garden maintenance. She'd developed a system that ensured everyone knew where Lucky would be on any given day, when Harold could expect dinner invitations, and how Rebecca's work schedule aligned with their family activities. Organization is love made visible, Emily had announced one morning while updating the calendar with Harold's upcoming doctor's appointment and Lucky's grooming session. The phrase was something Sarah used to say, and hearing it from Emily's lips reminded Robert how much his daughter had grown in wisdom, as well as confidence over the past year. The shared custody arrangement had evolved into something far more complex and beautiful than anyone had originally envisioned. Harold's apartment remained Lucky's official primary residence for legal purposes, but in practice, the dog spent time in both homes based on everyone's needs and schedules rather than rigid adherence to predetermined plans. During Harold's recent bout with flu, Lucky had stayed with Emily and Robert for 2 weeks, providing companionship and motivation for Harold's recovery through daily video calls. When Emily had participated in her school science fair, Harold had been her most enthusiastic supporter, helping her prepare a presentation about animal behavior that drew heavily on Lucky's unique social adaptations. The extended family had grown to include Rebecca and Sam, who'd become regular participants in their weekend activities and holiday celebrations. Rebecca's relationship with Robert had developed with the same thoughtful patience they'd brought to Lucky's integration. building on friendship and shared values rather than rushing toward commitments that might destabilize their carefully balanced family ecosystem. Good relationships are like gardens, Harold had observed during Rebecca's first Christmas dinner with them. They grow best when tended regularly, given appropriate space, and allowed to develop according to their own natural timeline. Emily's transformation over the past year had been remarkable to witness. The withdrawn, grieving child who'd barely spoken for months had become a confident, empathetic young person who navigated complex emotional situations with wisdom that impressed adults. Her teachers reported dramatic improvements in academic performance, social connections, and leadership abilities. More importantly, Emily had learned to carry her mother's memory as a source of strength rather than overwhelming sadness. She spoke about Sarah naturally and often, sharing stories with Harold and Rebecca, incorporating her mother's wisdom into daily decisions, and maintaining family traditions while creating new ones that reflected their evolving circumstances. Lucky's role in Emily's life had evolved as well. He remained her primary comfort during difficult moments, but he'd also become her collaborator in caring for others. Emily had started volunteering at the local animal shelter, using skills she'd developed while helping Lucky overcome his trauma to assist other animals in need of rehabilitation. Lucky taught me that healing isn't something that happens to you, Emily explained to a group of younger children during a shelter educational program. It's something you do every day by choosing to trust and love even when you're scared. Robert's own healing had been less dramatic but equally profound. Work remained important to him, but it no longer consumed his identity or provided his primary source of meaning. He'd learned to delegate more effectively, to maintain boundaries between professional and personal time, and to measure success in terms of relationships and personal growth rather than just financial achievement. The house itself reflected their transformation. Sarah's belongings remained integrated into their daily life, but no longer as shrines to preserved memory. Her books were being read again, her recipes were being adapted for Harold's dietary restrictions, and her gardening tools were being used to expand Emily's ever-growing project areas. The dining room, once used only for formal occasions, had become the heart of their extended family life. The table that had felt too large for just Robert and Emily now regularly accommodated Harold, Rebecca, Sam, Mrs. Chun, and whatever neighbors or friends had been invited to join their increasingly famous Sunday dinners. Mrs. Chun had taken particular satisfaction in their family's evolution, offering commentary that was both practical and philosophical. Grief teaches important lessons, she told Robert during Emily's recent birthday celebration. Shows us that love doesn't end with death, just changes form. Your family learned to let love grow instead of trying to preserve it like museum. Peace. The birthday party itself had been a testament to how much their world had expanded. Emily's school friends played in the backyard with Lucky and Sam, while their parents enjoyed adult conversation with Harold and Rebecca. The celebration included multiple generations, various species, and the kind of joyful chaos that suggested a family comfortable with complexity and change. Harold had presented Emily with a special gift that morning, a photo album containing pictures of Margaret with Lucky as a puppy, along with empty pages for Emily to fill with new memories. Your grandmother, Margaret, would have loved you very much, Harold had said, using the honorary title that had evolved naturally over the months. She believed that the best gift you could give someone was the confidence to create their own happiness. As Robert tucked Emily into bed that night, Lucky settled in his customary spot on the rug with the kind of contentment that spoke of a creature who knew himself to be deeply loved by multiple people. The dog's presence no longer felt like a miracle or a temporary blessing, but simply part of the natural order of their family life. "Daddy," Emily said as Robert turned off her bedroom light, Do you think Mommy knows how happy we are now?" Robert considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Through the window, he could see Harold's apartment building in the distance, where tomorrow Lucky would spend the day helping an elderly man feel less alone. Next weekend, Rebecca would join them for a camping trip that would introduce Lucky to new adventures while strengthening all their bonds. "I think she knows," Robert said finally. "And I think she's proud of the family we've built together, proud of how much love we've learned to share." Emily smiled and closed her eyes, one hand resting on Lucky's head as she drifted towards sleep. In the peaceful quiet of bedtime, Robert could hear the sounds of a house that had learned to be a home again, not the same home they'd been before, but something new and equally precious, built on love that had grown rather than diminished through sharing.